Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. My name is Yemi Oluseun. I'm based out in London, but right now I'm in Dubai. My background is growth. I do growth and transformation primarily for fintech and SaaS companies. Today, I'll be sharing with you on how to grow your businesses using KPIs. So we have a bit of a packed agenda. I am going to be talking about what the differences are between KPIs and OKRs. I also want to share a bit about how to define your own OKRs for your organization if you haven't already defined it. I also want to talk you through the customer sales journey, giving you a stage of growth right now. The focus, I imagine, would be having a sales funnel clearly defined. And I want to talk about each stage of the sales funnel and what the key KPIs could be for your stage of business. I'd also like to touch on things around why it's important to link your KPIs to your strategy. So here's a few things that we'll be covering in today's session. I really want to keep it as interactive as possible. So please stop me, ask me questions. Let's talk to each other, right? Please. But before we get started, I wanted to say congratulations, right? Because for most of you, if not everybody here, you've already found product market fit. You have traction. So I hope you celebrated yourself and give yourself a pat on the back. Like, well done, congratulations. But now the core focus probably is going to be around having that robust sales funnel. Because now you probably know who you're selling to, you know what you're selling to them, and hopefully you know where to find them. The focus is going to be how can I find more of the same people and how can I keep them in my ecosystem as long as I possibly can. Does that sound right? Can I get a one in the chat if that is a fair assumption? I want to make sure I'm talking to the right room and I'm pitching at the right level. So give me a one or a yes or a thumbs up. Talk to me, people. Or tell me no. You're wrong.
Oh,
Thank you,
yes.
guys. Amazing, amazing. Yes, I'm in the right room. Okay, people. So that's what I'm going to be talking to you about, right? Is how do we build a sales funnel and build OKRs and KPIs that let you do those two things, find more people and keep them in your ecosystem as long as possible. Okay, as I mentioned, I'll be telling you how to define your OKRs, and I like to link OKRs to the business vision and the mission. I think it's important to know exactly what's the vision of this business you're building. What's your mission? What are the core values you want to embody to enable you achieve that vision and mission? And based on that, what's going to be your strategy, right? Or your core product offering, which all of you already have. And then what are the key objectives that you've set for yourself, usually for the next 3 months to 1 year? So like what's on your roadmap? And how would you know your objectives has been successful using your key results, right? So that's what I'm going to be walking you through. That's one objective for today's call. The second thing is talking you through the sales funnel from start to finish, right? Is helping you see that you need to have a plan to take strangers or more strangers and convert them into customers and keep them as customers for as long as you possibly can. And if they decide they want to move on, have a plan for how you're going to reacquire them at some point in the future if now is not a good time for them. And for each stage, I'll also be talking you through like what the suggested metrics could be given the stage you are. That's my objective for this meeting. Before we get started, I wanted to cover some basic theory points so that we're all on the same page and then we get into the practical. Does that sound good? Can I get a thumbs up? Oh, yes,
Yes.
nod. Thank you, Kevin. I see you nodding. Thank you. Okay. So what is KPI? KPI, key performance indicators. They're essentially a measurable index. They're only useful in as far as they help you make decisions that inform your growth, right? It's tempting sometimes to just track things for tracking's sake, but what value is that? A KPI is only really useful if it can help you gather data, gather insights on your business that will then inform you, that will then enable you make decisions or do something that improves your business as a result. There are lots of different KPIs you can track. You can track KPIs around culture, KPIs around profitability, and on and on and on. The focus of this session, given what we just talked about, is going to be around growth, right? It's going to be about how do you track KPIs or identify the KPIs that will enable you grow your business. Again, just to clear up this, because this is a question that comes up very often, is like KPIs, OKRs, what's the difference? Like I already have OKRs, well, what's this KPI stuff? Very similar. They're both very similar. They work very well together, actually. The difference is this. Your key results tend to be linked to a specific objective, right? So there's a defined time frame to achieve it. Your KPIs, on the other hand, are ongoing, like it's a continuous metric that you're tracking. And it's an indication of health or indication of the underlying parameter that you're tracking. So an example using the human body that I try to put there just to make it come alive is you could have an okay around here, I want to improve my physical health and endurance. And how you know you've been successful is you completed a half a marathon in 2 hours, right? So once that is done, then tick okay, complete. But general KPIs for a human being, general health and wellness, is your heart rate, your BMI. These are things that you track regardless of whether or not you have the OKR, right? So they work well together or sometimes could be separate, right? So that's what I wanted to highlight. Does that make sense? If it doesn't make sense, please feel free to ask questions, use unmute yourself as well if you need to. Okay, let's get practical. How many of us here have set up a vision and a mission for our businesses? Like, who already has that set up? Can I get in the chat? Do you already have your mission? Or who, actually, just ask it differently. Who does not already have a clear mission and vision set up for their business? I want to know how much time to spend on this and core values. If you don't have one set up, can I get a me in the chat? Something. So it sounds like everybody has it already. Perfect. So given that you guys already all have that, then I want to suggest that a way to set up your OKRs is by reviewing those that you already have, right? So given the mission or given the vision of your business, your mission, the core values you set up for your company and your product offering or your strategy, imagine you guys already have your roadmaps clearly defined, right? So you know what your objectives are going to be for the next 3 months to 1 year, clearly defined. For each of those objectives, clearly identify 3 to 5 top key results that will happen as a result of you achieving those objectives. And by doing that, you have your OKRs defined. Tick. Does that make sense as a how-to? Yes? Thumbs up? Okay, cool. I see Kevin nodding. Thank you. Kevin, I'm using it as my barometer here. Thank you for being interactive with me. Thank you. So we then go to KPIs, right? And the way I like to define KPIs is by thinking about the sales funnel from start to finish. There's 6 key steps, the way I think about sales funnels, 6 key steps of the journey, right? Brand awareness. How do people first know that you exist? When they come into your world, how do you nurture them? Like, the rule about it takes 7 touch points for somebody to potentially do business with you. So it's what's your process for that? What can you do to expedite that? Are you going to have more binge-worthy content on your website? Like, how do you get them up to speed as quickly as possible on your stuff so they're comfortable enough to want to purchase? The third step being around conversion. What's the process for conversion? So is it going to be your website? If so, is the website optimized for sales? Is it going to be picking up the phone and getting on a sales call with a potential customer? Do you have a sales process and a sales script scripted out? Is that clearly defined? How are you going to deliver value to the customer? So once they've now become your customer and they're paying you, what's the delivery process? Then how are you going to retain them? So now they're your customer, they bought the first core product from you. What's the plan to keep them in your ecosystem as long as possible? Are you going to have upsells that you offer to them at some point? Are you going to have loyalty programs? What is the plan to keep them on the platform or in your world as long as possible? And then the last step is around offboarding. A lot of the times we don't like to think about offboarding, right? But life happens. People may decide to move on for whatever different reason, right? What's the process for that? Have you thought about like the questionnaires that you're going to ask them and how you're going to look to either reacquire them or downsell them something? So these are the 6 steps I expect that you would have thought about with your sales process. For each of these steps in the journey, one of the metrics I want to suggest is, if you think about the brand awareness, when we have like 3 or 4 platforms that you've focused your marketing efforts on, of those 3 or 4 platforms, you want to measure it. Like, so which of these platforms are effective? How many leads am I getting from each of these platforms, right? Because then you know that if, for example, most of your leads are coming from Instagram or coming from speaking, then maybe it makes sense to pump more effort into that. So that's one metric that I want to suggest you want to consider measuring, right? Is marketing leads you get per channel. The second will be around like your sales qualified leads per channel. So of all the leads that you get, so the first one is more around like quantity and volume. So you get all those leads coming through the doors for given channels. Of the leads you get, how many of them are qualified, right? So it's your sales qualified leads per channel again, because you want to know what's the quality of leads you get for each of the given channels that you have. Give you an example metric for that stage of the sales funnel. Then we're coming to the conversion stage of the sales funnel. You want to think about the conversion rate per channel. So it's of all the channels that you have customers coming to you from, which of them tend to convert faster? Like, do you find that customers that come through, say, referral partners convert faster than, say, customers that you find through Facebook, or customers so which channels tend to have quicker velocity of conversion? Might be a useful metrics to measure, because again, it tells you which of your marketing efforts make sense and where you should probably look to put more of your efforts on, because it might not bring the biggest volumes, but when it does bring a lead, it has the highest rate of conversion generally. So it might be worth knowing that. And very importantly, your acquisition cost per customer, right? Is how much is it costing you? And ideally, again, per channel, because you may find that the cost may differ depending on the channel that you use to acquire the customer, right? So it's what's the acquisition cost per channel for the customers. And that's it for the conversion. On the delivery side, a good metric to think about measuring, especially if you have like a SaaS platform or a platform where you can see how active the users are, is the average active time per user. Because here's why. If you notice that a user's usage of your platform is declining, what does that tell you? That potentially they might be looking to cancel their subscription, right? They're not getting as much value from the platform. So that could be maybe an example leading metric telling you that, hey, something is coming up that isn't quite working for this customer, so I should probably look to do something about it, right? The time to value. So it's like, so from when the customer first signs up and uses your product, how long does it take for them to get the first aha moment? Say, yes, this is giving me value and I'm enjoying this product. It's worth measuring that because, again, we live in a short microwave society. People want to kind of get that aha moment as quick as possible. So it's how can you shorten the experience and get them to a point where they get value from the product as quickly as possible? Might be worth measuring depending on your kind of business, right? The quality of ratings you get, the number of referrals, and sometimes the delivery cost per customer. I say this because at this stage, you probably are trying to find your anchor customers, right? Do you all have anchor customers, like your flagship customers found, or is that part of the milestones? I get a yes or no. Modeli, I see you nodding. Is it because yes? Perfect, cool. So to find your anchor customers, you might have done things that do not scale, which is expected and you should do, right? But because of that, you may want to track how much it's costing you to deliver value to them, because there's only so much flex you can keep giving, right? So, and it gets to a point where it's no longer profitable, right? So it might be a worthwhile metric to track. Maybe not at this point right now, because fast growth, you're still trying to like please as many people as possible. But as you get that critical mass, you probably want to start looking at this cost and thinking like, okay, how can we get to a more profitable unit economics, and maybe look at the customers we have and see which ones make sense to keep or upgrade into a higher package. Yeah. And then with the retention, you're looking at what's your average lifetime value per customer. So when they come into your world, what is that customer worth to you? This is important to know, right? Because if you know that, you know how much you can spend to acquire the customer, and how quickly can you get them to repurchase from you as well. So on average, what's the repurchase rate that you have, or upgrade rate? And what's the payback period on average for your customer is worthwhile knowing as well, because you may find that the customer doesn't become profitable until, say, maybe the fourth month of being with you if you have a SaaS-based product, because you spend the first 3 months on acquisition costs. So it's what is that? And then with your offboarding, things like your churn rate, of course, I'm sure you probably all know that. And the win-back rate is when you lose a customer, on average, how successful are you at winning them back? So these are some of the metrics that you may want to consider tracking in terms of growth. Now, the ones that you prioritize, and we'll come to that in a minute, will be dependent on what the core OKR is for the specific period, because I do not by any means suggest that you try and track all of them at the same time. That's just going to be overload. You might be in a season where you're like, hey, we want to focus on growth. We want to focus on acquisition of customers. So all the metrics you're tracking is around acquisition, right? You may be in a season where you're thinking about, oh, listen, I need to make sure that the customers I've acquired stay on my platform as much as possible. So you're tracking metrics around retention and engagement. That might be the focus for that quarter. Or you might find that you're losing a lot of customers that come on board, and the focus might be around churn rate and win back rate. So the core KPI that you choose to track to some degree is linked to your stage of growth and also to your OKR for that season. Does that make sense? I see Chris nodding. Thank you. Or who does it not make sense to? Please unmute, ask me questions if it doesn't make sense. Thank you, Kevin, for nodding. Okay, cool. So let's move on then to the next slide. Thank you, Larry Day. The other things that I haven't put on here that on the diagram, because I know I was so great focused, right, is this too. I think it's so important to call it out, is whatever you do, don't forget to keep an eye on your cash, right? Don't lose sight of cash in the heat of all the growth and all the exoticness. Make sure you know what your burn rate is and how much runway you have to go, right? Because ultimately cash is king, because one of the biggest killers of startup and growth-based companies is they run out of cash. That's probably one of the things you want to track as you grow. Then moving on to, I suppose, why it's important to link KPIs, because I started this by talking about OKRs, because I know this session is supposed to be focused on just KPIs, but I've started talking about OKRs first. Here's why. If you don't, linking the KPIs and OKRs and strategy together is important, because if you don't, you may set yourself up to fail because you start to encourage infighting, right? Because very often I see things like, sales and marketing not getting along because they have two different OKRs and two different KPIs, and they start bickering amongst themselves. Like sales says, oh, marketing gave me poor leads, that's why I can't convert people. Marketing says sales are not doing a good job of following up and they don't know how to sell, they don't follow the script, and there's all that bickering back and forth. Here's the point. When you're setting the KPIs and setting your OKRs, you want to make sure that you're assigning an owner, and you're assigning it to people and assigning it in a way that encourages cooperation across the key people that need to deliver on the KPI. So on here, I'm going to send you a copy of this slide, by the way, so you guys can review it in your own time. I'm not going to read through all of it, but I've given some examples. So classic one is sales and marketing. Another example is around engineering and operations. So you said to engineering, hey, 100% uptime operations, we don't want to reduce cost. Those are two conflicting goals, right? And if you're not careful, you can have two teams fighting themselves in your organization, and it's not good for the customer or for your growth. So it's making sure whatever you set up, it's synergy, it has synergy across your organization. Yeah. So essentially, summary of all this is, please don't set up OKRs and KPIs in silos. It's very easy to sit down with your ops guys and be like, oh yeah, ops, I'm going to set up a KPI for you, and another one for marketing, another one for sales, and not thinking about the whole thing holistically. Might not be a big deal right now because you guys are still in growth and maybe don't have that many big teams, but bear it in mind as you grow to think holistically as you set up your KPIs. Okay, so finally, some key guidelines, which most of this stuff we've already covered in some way or another in the previous slides, is please don't try and track everything. I know what gets tracked gets managed, but if everything is important, then guess what? Nothing is important, right? So trying to track 10 KPIs might be overload. You may want to choose 3 to 5 core KPIs that are important. Okay, you don't want to have too many KPIs because then it's like, it's overload, right? You don't know what you're tracking. So it's probably important look to find 3 to 5 KPIs that are your core KPIs, given your season and your stage of growth, that you're going to make sure you have a finger on the pulse on, number one. Number two, I think it's worth recognizing the difference between a leading KPI and a lagging KPI. It's very easy to kind of say, oh, my KPI is my revenue, right? So what's the biggest KPI? If I have money in the bank is KPI. Yes, but revenue tends to be a lagging indicator. Usually when you find there's no money in the bank, it's almost too late because a lot of stuff has happened that you've missed that has now led to no money in the bank or not the kind of money that you want to have in the bank. So it's knowing what's the difference between the two. So an example could be if for example, you're tracking your marketing qualified leads, that's more of a leading indicator. If you see that there's a decline in that, then that potentially tells you that revenue might be low for that period, right? And because you've spotted that early, you can start to proactively take steps to remediate that and hopefully rescue the situation before it gets too dire, right? That's why it's important to know which of my KPIs are leading and which ones are lagging. And given that growth is the focus, you may want to have a lot more leading KPIs and a lot less lagging ones, apart from the two that I mentioned, right? The cash balance and the cash burn. Those are lagging indicators. We'll come to that in a minute, but it's worth you keeping an eye on them because you don't want to not keep an eye and then find out you don't have any money. So but in the main, I expect that most of the KPIs you're focused on will be leading KPIs. Then third thing is around making sure what you're tracking as KPIs. So of the 3 to 5 KPIs I'm suggesting that you select for your startup, you want to try and select ones that are actually actionable KPIs, not vanity ones, right? It's tempting to kind of track the number of followers. I'm sure most of you guys probably would do that now, given your stage, but still worth mentioning, right? To track things like number of app downloads, number of visitors, number of vanity type stuff, right? Because it feels good to say, I've got this, but those things don't always convert to actual revenue or growth, right? So it's realizing what are actual KPIs that are indicators of growth versus vanity ones. Yeah. The fourth one is understanding that some KPIs, understanding the difference between causation and correlation. Again, it goes back to like social media followers and website traffic. That an increase in that does not necessarily cause an increase in revenue. They might be correlated, but it's not a direct one-for-one link. You may have 1 million followers but not be making any money, right? So that's not a very direct causal link. So it's trying to know, so when you find two variables, understanding like, are these two variables causal or is it just correlated? Because if you don't really understand the difference between the two, there might be a lot of superstitious activity, things like, oh yeah, every time it's sunny, I make a lot of sales. So I'm praying for sun to come out so that sun is like, what is it the sun that's bringing the sales, or what is the factor behind the sun that is driving the sales? And it's that kind of thinking that you want to try and get to when you're setting up the KPIs, right? To understand what are the drivers influence that KPI's volatility. 5, again, understanding that I know I say maybe look to 3 to 5 core KPIs that you want to track. But again, it depends on your audience, right? Because again, given that you're startups and you have like all the stakeholders that you have to manage, investors, your employees, the management and all of so the KPIs that they're interested in might be different depending on who you're talking to. And there are 3 broad buckets of types of indicators, right? So you have like more of your finance, accounting type indicators or KPIs. They tend to be lagging, as we talked about, right? Tend to be things around your cash flow, your cash burn. It's good to know this stuff, but realize that they're not factor for growth. They're not necessarily things that you have control over, but you need to know it for accounting purposes. The things that you probably want to know for investor type purposes, right? So investors like to know this kind of stuff. But again, when it comes to actually running your business, is it something you have direct control over? Maybe not. So things like your monthly recurring revenue. Having that as your core KPI is interesting to know, but it's not something you have direct. There are multiple KPIs that build up to that core revenue, right? There's things like you're getting good leads through the door, making sure you're keeping the customers. So there's other sub factors that build up to that monthly recurring revenue. So tracking that as the main revenue might be a bit challenging, right? Because you don't have direct influence over it. And then more importantly, we're going to come to that in a minute, it doesn't change frequently enough for you to actually see volatility. Like it changes once a month. Once a month is too long progress wise to know what you need to course correct or not. So maybe might not be a good management metrics. The other kind of management metrics that I like leading metrics that you may want to consider or prioritize amongst your top 3 to 5 is things like your customer acquisition cost. Right? I want to know, is it costing more to acquire customers, or are the costs dropping? You expect that as you grow, the costs would hopefully start to drop because your brand awareness is growing, people are knowing more of who you are, or so it's tracking that and seeing how that should influence your pricing of your services and profitability, maybe. The time to value for the customer is like, so when you get this customer and they come on board with you, what's the average time to value? Are customers waiting so long to get any value from your product and then getting bored and unsubscribing and moving on? Like, how can you keep them long enough? When they come on board, how often do they tend to use your product? Are you noticing a decline in their usage? Because if you are, then it's telling you that they're not getting as much value, they're getting bored or they're forgetting or whatever. You want to invite them back, right? Kind of how Netflix would do it with you. Like Netflix would tell you, oh, there's a new show that you haven't logged in for a while, they tell you to come back, right? Or Instagram would tell you your friend just posted in a long time, right? So if somebody hasn't posted for a long time and they eventually post, they'll notify all of their contacts and say, hey, they've just posted, because they want to keep that person encouraged to keep posting, right? By telling all their friends, and hopefully everybody likes their post and comments and like, yay, dopamine, I should probably post more, right? So it's, what can you do? What's your Instagram equivalent for your platform? So when people are dropping their usage, how do you encourage them to come back? Or Korea. I mean, Dubai right now, if you don't order for a long time, they give you a voucher for free food. It's like, oh, come get free food from us. AKA, we haven't seen you in a long time, spend some money, please. So it's those kind of things, right? So what are your leading indicators that will help you, that would serve as a lever for you to control your business and help you drive growth? And then 2 last points I wanted to talk about is, for each KPI you set, you may want to consider having a KPI champion, right? Again, as the business, maybe not so much now. Now you're the champion for everything, right? You're the everything champion. But as it grows, perhaps you want to have like a key point of contact. And to the point earlier, there's no point having like a growth. If something impacts, say, 2 functions, it might be worth having a co-ownership set up for that KPI, right? So that encourages partnership as opposed to infighting. And then finally, your core KPIs ideally should be things that can actually be analyzed and reported on a regular basis, as we talked about, right? So ideally, the core KPIs are things that will change on a weekly basis, and we'll talk about how you control your KPIs in a minute. But they change regularly enough that you can see, okay, so this week we did this, and based on this, something has happened. It's easier to manage and easier to control, and you get quicker feedback than you're tracking something that's more long-term and more of a lagging indicator, and so harder to control. So you may want to consider that when you're selecting your core KPIs. In terms of control, you don't have to set up all this meetings or all the structures. It's just things to think about. These are all guidelines. Tailor it to suit your business. Again, as you grow, probably want to have some kind of operational or daily stand-up. Maybe you have virtual assistants or whatever. It's like, so what's the daily check-in that you're doing? 15 minutes max, right? It's like, what's the goal for today? What did you do yesterday? And what's the plan? Any issues or challenges, kind of what's the agenda? And then weekly, more of a retrospective is what went well, what should we have done better, do we need to course correct ahead of the following week, right? That probably is more still at a team and functional level. And then monthly, this probably is where you may want to start inviting I don't know if you have investors or stakeholders, they want to get updates on your startup on a monthly basis. So at this point, you're looking at, okay, so given that I'm going on a monthly level, what do these investors want? Which KPIs are important to them? Because your management KPI levers might be different to what your investors care about. They probably want to see like your MRR. See, it makes sense at this level to see your MRR because they can see month on month what has changed. But if you are tracking MRR on a weekly basis, then nothing changed, right? So you don't know, and it's all a surprise to you. So it's monthly, right? On a monthly basis. The point on there is like, so it's not just your management team, but also any kind of external stakeholders that are interested in you. And you're showing them things like your RAID log. So like any kind of risks, issues, actions, or dependencies that you've come across, and you want them to make decisions and help you steer the organization. So there's no nasty surprises. Quarterly, I don't know, might also align with your board meetings if you have a board. At this point, you're looking to like align your OKRs. So if, for example, month on month, you've noticed a specific KPI has dropped significantly or is not doing as well, you may want to set OKRs. That would mean that the entire organization's resources is then focused on improving that specific KPI, right? So that's where you set your objective and the key results that you expect to see for the next quarter or for the next 3 months. And you review that every 3 months. And then you may want to have like an annual strategic. So you look at your overall strategy, the OKRs for the next 4 quarters, usually like an away day kind of planning. But again, driving that planning session would be let's look at the KPI and the year-on-year performance, because now you start to have more data, right? You've been running your business for a while. So this time last year, where were we? This time this year, where were we? Are there any fluctuations month on month? Kind of review. Probably want to do on an annual basis. And then, of course, any kind of ad hoc review meetings, usually firefighting, something, there's an emergency and something needs to get done. So just get it done. So these might be the kind of controls you may want to have in place to help you govern your OKRs. I'm just looking at my phone because I don't have a sense of time. What, see how much time I've got left. Okay, cool. Does that all make sense? Because that's the core of what I wanted to present today. And I'm going to open up the floors for questions because you guys already have your vision and mission defined. If you didn't have it defined, I'd have guided you through how to think about defining it and all that kind of cool stuff. But since you have that, I'm not going to do that. We can spend more time talking about this because I think this is really going to be the core of your focus, is really defining the sales funnel and making sure it's as robust as possible. At the heart of this stuff, most of it is around having a good CRM tool and having good tracking on your website and tracking the customer from when they buy, and you can see all the various engagements and touch points that they have with your business. So we could talk about this, we could talk about KPIs. I'm going to stop here and open up the floor for questions.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Which is the best horizon to define the KPIs, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months?
So KPIs by nature are continuous, right? That's what I expect. So with key results, they usually linked to an objective, specific objective, an OKR. The guideline for OKRs is 3 months, right? Maximum 3 months, and you review them every 3 months. With your KPIs, they're continuous metrics that you're tracking all the time.
Okay,
Have I answered your question?
Can I define the approach to get the right number? To split it weekly or monthly or bi-monthly,
Okay, so if give me a specific example of a KPI you want to improve. Let's talk specifics because then this will make it more
maybe
helpful. Is there a specific KPI?
Number of customers, for example. How can I approach the right number to split it weekly, monthly, bi-monthly?
Okay, so the goal is to improve the number of customers. The leading indicator for that is your leads, right? So before you get customers, what do they have to do? This is why, again, to know the journey. So before they become a customer and convert, they have to be nurtured. They have to be made aware of the brand, right? So number of customers is more of a lagging indicator, given what we just talked about. The leading indicator is how many leads are you getting through the door, right? So for that is, I want to improve my customers by, say, 20%, right? If you know that for each step, there's usually an 80% drop-off rate. So to get to 20% increase in my customer base, I have to increase my number of sales qualified leads by, say, let's say 50%, right? I have to increase my brand awareness by 70% because I expect a drop-off of 20% at each step, which is natural attrition, right? So really, the metric then becomes, how can I improve? I want my marketing leads by 70% in the next quarter, right? So you can set up an OKR around that, right? So the OKR is increase leads, and that's one of the examples on here, right? So here, actually, this is a perfect. So the faulty OKR because this is what I was saying about making sure you set up holistic OKRs that take into account the full organization, because the faulty OKR in this example that you're giving, right, could be tell sales, you have to increase conversion by 20%, tell marketing, increase lead generation by 30%. But maybe a better way to do it would be to say something like sales and marketing increase revenue by 20% through joint efforts, and expects you to do that. If you guys are successful, I expect to see that your lead generation will be improved by 30% and your conversion by 15%. Right. So every week you can see, okay, so this week, how many leads do we have in the funnel or in the pipeline? We have 100. How does that compare to last week that we had? And you can start to measure the increments and see if you're on track to hit those numbers by the end of the quarter. Does that make sense?
My question, how can I get number? How can I know it will be 20%? And I just can imagine it, or you have some kind of approach to do that to get that number,
So you reverse engineer it, right? So you probably have a target of revenue that you want to hit this year. So it's what's your target revenue that you want to hit this year? Do you have that number defined with your investors or with yourself?
Yeah, not yet.
Okay, that might be a starting point, right? So sit down and think about how much profit or revenue did you make last year? And this year, this is where the annual planning is useful. So like there's different levels of meetings, right? So you sit down with your investors or yourself if you are the investor and the CEO and everything, sit down with yourself and ask yourself, okay, this is what I got last year. This year, what do I want to get? What's good? What does good look like for me? And then based on that, you reverse engineer it.
So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, your approach, it looks very much more B2C. What about B2B on the B2B side? It's maybe a bit harder to track things weekly, or at least you can track it, but on the B2B side, sometimes it does take like a longer sales cycle. So for example, we deal with property developers and also with banks. Sometimes it does take a bit longer to, sort of close on some of those. So what would you suggest for that, or still use the weekly and, still use the weekly approach in doing that, or is it more of an OKR? Like, how would you look at that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I actually don't think the approach changes if it's B2B or B2C, right? So if anything, because you have a longer sales cycle, it means that you probably need to do a lot more work of getting a lot more leads through the funnel, and also spend a lot of time thinking about how am I going to nurture them as quickly as possible and get that 7 touch points, right, with them so they can convert. So the basic premise is still the same, right? Is even if it's B2B, you still need to get leads through the funnel, right? So it's reverse engineer it. So if you want to hit a certain revenue number by, say, next year, how many leads, given your sales cycle, do you need to have in your funnel at any one point, taking into account the expected attrition and other kinds? So it's still the same logic.
It is the same logic. I think what she's trying to say is that you need to look at the leading indicators more for B2C, B2B, because you're right, it does take longer, right? So go farther back. Like, what do you need to do to get the outcome, which is going to take longer in B2B.
And after 3 months, 6 months, the cycle will keep going. The beginning take longer. It take like a longer time. But after 3 months, your sales or your conversion can measure. I say Brazil so into that.
Okay, one more question.
Yeah, but
More makes sense.
Yeah.
You can go.
Hello, how would you advise?
amazing. I like that you just 1 second, please. I like that you crowdsourced the answers there. Thank you for that. Well, hopefully that makes sense to you, right? Because yeah, cool. All right. Sorry, next question.
Yeah, hello. How would you
Hi.
advise we avoid evolving into silos that you mentioned earlier with more independent and uncoordinated KPIs?
Say that again. How would you avoid silos
Avoid
from happening
evolving.
with your KPIs?
We're small and we're gonna go hopefully get bigger. Once we get bigger, we become independent small teams, and they have their own independent KPIs, and they tend to be uncoordinated.
So you avoid it, or try to avoid it by doing this, right? So being clear on what your vision is, what your mission is, and based on that, what's the overall strategy, right? So you as the CEO is still involved at this level. And based on your strategy, you've set out key objectives for each of your direct reports. Does that make sense? So you essentially avoid it by controlling the strategy and objectives as tightly as you can.
All of your goals and KPIs need to go back to your core mission and vision. That's what she mentioned right at the beginning. So they can't be like random and not aligned with the core.
Okay.
And your core can change, right? So like, what phase are you in right now?
So what I'm saying is, what happens is that eventually we make departments. Just happens that departments just come into existence with their own KPIs.
But that's incorrect, because they can't have their own KPIs. It has to align back to the corporate goal.
Yeah.
Right? And so it has to be
Exactly.
down and not bottom up. Sorry, I'm just.
Exactly. No, you're doing a good job. I thank you for being my assistant in the room. Love it. Thank you. That's exactly what Alda said. So I don't know if that answers your question, right? The point is, a department isn't just going to magically appear, because hopefully it's your company. You still control it. You're the CEO. You're the ultimate budget holder. So they won't just form a department without telling you. If they're forming a department, it's because it aligns with a strategy, right? And based on the formation, you set out the key objectives that you want to give to them. And the person that's heading up that department is going to be one of your direct reports. You're probably going to have one-to-ones with them, review meetings with them, performance reviews for promotions and salaries. That's part of the ways you control it, right? It's like, so if I'm going to have a new department for, I don't know, you're going into a new country, Southeast Asia, my new head of Southeast Asia, you're not just going to leave him to run his thing by himself, right? You're going to set for him what are the objectives that you have to achieve for me to know you're successful in what I've given you. And by the way, that's going to inform your pay rise and your promotion. Does that make sense? Yeah, I see Kevin nodding, but I can't see you nodding. I don't know people's names in the rooms. That's why I like it on Zoom, because you can see people's names and just say their names, but I can't call you guys out. But hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, my question is, by defining a KPI, let's say, for example, in terms of sales, generate leads, and obviously at the end, it will involve the conversions as well. So let's say last year we did X amount, and this time we want to do 3 times of the X amount, and for that we define a KPI. To get those KPI answered, there will be a team behind it. There will be marketing team where we will have a few people. There will be social media team, lead generation team where we will have few people. There will be on ground field business development team where we will have few people. How to measure or how to track them, so because they will be filling up the KPIs and what kind of, so we can give them a KPI target, or I don't know how do you define that, but how do we measure them so they are motivated enough and they get this done on the right time, and so we can go towards that growth 3 times or whatever we did in the last year. I mean, the team behind it, there will be a team of maybe 10, 15, 20 people behind it. So if I define a KPI for my team or for myself, there will be people behind it. How do I make them, get this done? Or is there any specific tool for that?
There's a lot of like performance management tools out there, but I suppose in terms of your question, so if, for example, you have sales and marketing, like you told, I'm just recapping your question to you so you can tell me if it makes sense, because there was some background noise. If the goal is sales and marketing, I want you to increase conversion by 20%, is your question, how would you then track the individual tasks that they have to do at the internal, right? Okay, so couple of ways. This is, I suppose, unless you're if you are the VP of sales and the CEO at the same time, then maybe yes, this falls in your remit. This is why you have the weekly meetings and the daily calls, right? Is you're taking this broad banner of like, this is the project, because an OKR essentially is a project, right? The project is increase revenue by 20%. To get to this revenue, what do we need to do? You sit down around the team and get like lots of good ideas. Okay, we need to do more marketing campaigns, more social media, we need to get more conferences, we need to get, so like all these various ideas, write them out as tasks, and for each task you assign an owner and a due date, and that essentially is what you're tracking, or the team head is tracking on a weekly basis, right? So you've taken this big OKR and you've created little tasks out of it, and it becomes like your project plan, but it's a project plan for that department. Or if it's you that's doing, if you are the department, for you and that team, when you speak to them and you do your one-to-ones with them, that's what you're tracking them to.
Okay.
Yeah, and you could take it one step further by saying, okay, so you track, so say for example, one task is we need to do 5 roadshows this year, because we expect that by doing 5 roadshows, we're going to say 500 leads based on our previous experience. We know that for each roadshow, we get 100 leads. If we do 5, we're expecting or estimating 500 leads, for example. You assign one person to it, and then you're tracking them weekly. So maybe, for example, they have to reach out to the organizers, and maybe one of the organizers is cancelled or something. That's now going to be tracked as an amber status, because the project line item is book space and XYZ roadshow cancelled, so it's now amber. You now need to find a replacement. That's potentially one of the risks or issues that you now want to manage, or maybe report to your board as hey, we're not likely going to hit this OKR or this KPI because something has happened and we now need to change tact. Can you help me, or can you put me in touch with somebody else, right? The point is you have a project plan, and the project plan then informs your RAID log, your risks and issues. And those two things together would inform the monthly meetings that you escalate to your management or your investors.
But it's sort of similar to the other question, right? So you start off with a goal, right? How much do you want to increase revenue or whatever?
Yeah.
And you work backwards, and you can just use Excel in terms of like software and just have these weekly meetings. But make sure those KPIs are well understood, they're aligned to your corporate goal, right? And they're measurable, and you can change, like you can actually cause them to change, right? And you just have to keep on people, right?
Right, thank you. I see some questions in the chat. Kevin, do you want to unmute and ask your question? With any ideas for KPIs if we only have one exclusive global distributor who has sales targets? Customer acquisition is completely out of our control.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you've just seen good examples from other organizations or something we can learn from others, or what you'd suggest in a situation like that.
I actually think that's a bit of a risk because you don't want to have one. So the typical advice, if you're thinking about growing your companies, you don't want to have one customer that's bringing, I think more than, is it 20% of your revenue from one customer?
Yeah.
That is a big risk because then should they decide to quit and go somewhere else, they can hold you to ransom. Is that the case for you? Are you saying 20% of your
Yeah,
revenue
but
comes
as
from
a
this one
startup,
customer?
as a startup, we've got to start somewhere. And so as
Absolutely.
a product launch with a head customer, as we get going, and we're just launching literally this month, we've got to walk before we run. So
I agree. I completely agree. This is what I said about having anchor clients, right? So when you first start, you're doing things like Unscale, getting your anchor client to get that flagship client. But I think one of the core KPIs needs to be around how do you acquire more customers? How do you get more customers
how to
that look
diversify.
like your anchor customers? Yeah, exactly. Would actually be the KPI I'm focused on if I was
Yeah.
in your shoes
Yeah.
or working with you.
Yep. Nope. Good
Does that
point.
answer
And
your
it's
question?
going to be a delicate balance of focus with also diversification. We've got to
Yeah,
make
absolutely. It's like, so how do you, yeah, but hopefully because you now built that cadence with this anchor customer, you know, the kind of things that they want, you probably try and get it to as much. But I think this is why it goes to, I suppose, having clear values and mission, because if you know, if, for example, if you know why the customer has chosen to work with you, because they're not just being benevolent to you, right? They probably are working with you for a certain reason, right? So maybe you don't have to be 100% perfect on everything, but there's just this one thing they always want you to deliver on. Know what that one thing is and do it well for them all the time, just to keep them happy and keep them sweet. So you have enough headspace to focus on getting new business, right? So it's, don't try and be all things to this person and become a mini slave to them. It's like, instead focus on what's the one thing I can do to make them happy so I can have space.
What matters to them? Yeah, good point. Yeah, excellent. Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you. Then Jessica had a question on the chat as well. How do you confirm that your OKR is holistic to guide your defining KPI? That's a good question, actually. What key indicators would you consider? So Jessica, just to clarify, are you saying how do you make sure you don't have a KPI that is, or an OKR that is going to encourage infighting? Is that what you're asking me?
Yes.
Okay. I think it's, again, by thinking about it. So when you define what the OKR is, think about like, who are the people or who are the key players that need to do something to make this achieved, right? So think about the key players. So on a best effort basis, you have those key players as your champions. You may still get it wrong. And you know you've gotten it wrong when the infighting starts. And you have one-to-ones with your directs and they're saying, oh, well, that person. And then you realize what's the root cause for this problem. And hopefully you may see that it's because an OKR has been defined wrongly. So they are incentivized to fight against each other, not to work for the common good. So it's a bit of being proactive by you thinking about who you think would be the right champion, but then also you being reactive by observing. So once you set it up, how is it working and what's broken?
All right, thank you.
You're welcome, Jessica. Thank you for the question. Any other questions?
Absolutely.
Gabby, anything in the room?
Nothing.
No, I don't believe so.
Amazing. Okay, so if that's it, then I think we've come to the end of our time together. Thank you so much for having me, everybody. It's been a pleasure. Sunil, thank you for the invitation. Please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. My name is Yemi Oluseun. I think I'm the only one on LinkedIn with that name, so please do reach out. And all the best building your business. I look forward to seeing you guys succeed and fly. Thank you very much.
Thanks so
Thank
much,
you.
Yemi.
All right then. Bye.